Thank you so much, Broadcasting. All right, well, good morning and welcome to the subcommittee on K-12 higher education and CIP to order. And will the committee secretary please take the roll?
Assemblywoman Benitez Thompson.
Here.
Assemblywoman Carlton. Assemblyman Farson. Assemblywoman Gorlow.
Here.
Assemblyman Hafen.
Here.
Assemblywoman Howdeggy. Assemblyman Levitt.
Here.
Assemblyman Roberts.
Here.
Senator Canizero. Senator Kekeffer.
Here.
Senator Rowdy.
Here.
Senator Sievers-Gansert.
Here.
Chair Dondara-Loop.
Here. And please mark Speaker Frierson absent excused, and please mark the others present as they arrive. Thank you very much. Please, members, remember to mute yourselves when you're not talking. And would you, all of those joining us virtually, I know that we've gone over many of the options for you to join us virtually. And so please know that there is a help button on the NELIS website, and it does explain all that. And we will be going through the budgets today. We have 4 budgets from the Department of Education. And so we're going to welcome Superintendent Ebert and Deputy Superintendent Heidi Hartz back to the subcommittee. We're going to invite them to begin their presentation, and we will pause after each budget for questions, as there are so many. So please, Superintendent Ebert, when you are ready, please proceed.
Good morning. Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, my name is Joan Ebert. I am the State Superintendent of Public Instruction. I'm joined today by Deputy Heidi Hartz. Excited to be here with you this morning. You see our mission. It has not changed or wavered. Next slide has our values. In the meetings this morning, we do hit on every single one of these with equity driving the work. And I think most importantly, in the work here with all of you is that you have an understanding of the transparency, where the dollars flow in order for you to make informed decisions. This is our 3rd session and together, and I was reflecting last night about, where we are, where we've been in just a very short period of time, from the special session to now, and all the iterations of work that everyone has participated in, those in the department, as well as the governor's finance office and everyone else involved in education. And back in the fall, in preparation, all of you were well aware that we were asked to create a budget that had a 12% reduction. Some of the hardest things to do in anyone's life, but one who is a lifelong educator, to be asked to prepare a budget in that way. It was very difficult to do, but over time, and as we saw the economic forum and different positive things coming into our state, that was reduced quite a bit. However, we still had to prepare a budget that had reductions to it. I want you to be well aware that we do not operate in a silo. We have worked since the crisis came upon all of us with all of the state superintendents, as well as the state public charter school authority, and literally went line by line to make a determination on those difficult decisions that we had to make. So just set that out as a starting point, or maybe an ending point, since this is our 3rd time together, but laying out the context of where we have been, where we're going, The Commission on School Funding, as you well are aware, they're working on optimal funding and how we can get to that point. And hopefully it will be sooner rather than later. But today we are presenting to you what is in the governor's proposed budget. And thank you. We will take each account and then we will pause for questions. So with that, I will turn the time over to Deputy Heidi Hartz.
Good morning. For the record, I'm Heidi Hartz, and I serve as the Deputy Superintendent for Business and Support Services in the Nevada Department of Education. We have 4 budget accounts scheduled for hearing this morning. Budget account 2699, Other State Education Programs. Budget account 2615, the School Remediation Trust Fund. Budget account 2698, School Safety. And budget account 2704, the Bullying Prevention Account. The first budget account we wish to review with you this morning will be budget account 2699, the Other State Education Programs. This budget account includes funding that is passed through to school districts and charter schools through various state-funded grants, as well as state general fund dollars that are designated as maintenance of effort for federal grants, incentives for certain educational personnel, and it includes additional funding for other entities such as Jobs for America's Graduates and the Public Broadcast Services. Our presentation this morning is focused primarily on programs and activities that have been impacted by various decision units included in the governor's recommended budget. Many of the decision units presented in this budget account restore funding, which was reduced during the 31st special session. However, there are additional decision units that were necessary to reduce funding or to undo a portion or all of these restorations in order for the governor to prepare and submit a balanced budget. The first set of decision units this morning pertain to the Read by Grade 3 program. As a reminder, we've previously discussed Read by Grade 3 and related decision units during our March 3rd budget hearing. In this budget account, the governor has recommended decision unit E277, which restores funding for the Read by Grade 3 allocations to school districts. The restoration totals approximately $31 million in each year of the biennium, and it restores the funding that was previously reduced during the 31st special session. Decision Unit E686 reduces this funding by $16.6 million in the first fiscal year of the biennium and $16.8 million in the second. The recommended funding that would remain to be allocated for literacy services would total approximately $14.8 million in fiscal year 2022 and $14.7 million in fiscal year 2023. Later in the presentation, we will have a decision unit that does indicate that these funds are recommended to be transferred to the state education funding account and allocated on a per pupil basis through the pupil-centered funding plan. As a reminder, NRS 388.159 currently requires that all elementary school principals designate a literacy specialist. That individual is responsible for scheduling and assisting with professional development specifically related to literacy, and assisting teachers by implementing a system of supports that would include intervention services and intensive instruction for students who have been identified as deficient in their reading skills. Currently, Read by Grade 3 funding is allocated through a non-competitive grant process, and that non-competitive grant process was approved during the 2019 legislative session. As a point of reference for the benefit of the subcommittee, in fiscal year 2020, funding was allocated to school districts based on an average salary amount of approximately $71,000 per year. And additionally, each school district received approximately $2,000 for professional development specific to literacy. Slide 9 provides information on the Read by Grade 3 program. It notes that in Nevada, all K-5 public elementary schools that were identified as being below reading level for their grade in the 2019 through 2020 academic year totaled 114,559 students. We've also included a graphic on this slide that shows the program goals for Read by Grade 3, which is to improve student achievement in reading, to improve literacy instruction, to build a reading assessment framework, develop cultures of literacy throughout the state, and then to ensure accessibility for all learners. During the COVID-19 pandemic, our Read by Grade 3 staff have conducted virtual office hours to provide support to our educators across the state. They've also worked in partnership with the regional professional development programs to ensure that they are modeling strategies that support effective literacy instruction. This online collaboration and networking has supported educators in literacy instruction, as well as social and emotional learning, distance learning, and assessments. Slide 10 illustrates the outcomes of the successes experienced since the need to address literacy was adopted into statute and funding was also added for these purposes. This table shows the national assessment of educational progress amongst fourth grade reading performance, comparing national data to Nevada scores. I would note that data is not available for the 2019-2020 school year because the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, was not conducted due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Nevada requested and received a waiver from the U.S. Department of Education, which was approved, recognizing it was difficult to assess students when they were no longer attending class in person. The next set of decision units pertain to the underperforming schools or turnaround program. Decision Unit E278 restores the funding for this program, which was reduced during the 31st special session. Decision Unit E686 reduces this funding. While these decision units result in there not being any funding available during the upcoming biennium, the department does want to share with you that we have already begun working with schools who would have otherwise received this funding to identify federal supports that can be leveraged to support individual schools to drive forward with the improvement. Decision Unit E279 restores funding for the College and Career Readiness Program. The restoration is recommended to total $5 million in each fiscal year, and there is a corresponding decision unit that then reduces that funding in an equivalent amount. The College and Career Readiness Program supports competitive grants for school districts and charter schools to develop and to provide dual enrollment for their students who are also taking college level courses while still in high school, to develop competitive science, technology, engineering, and mathematics grant programs at both the middle school and high school levels to assist with college readiness amongst our students. And then a portion of the funding available for college and career readiness is also specifically dedicated to competitive grants for school districts, charter schools, and nonprofit organizations to develop and implement work-based learning programs, which was a pilot project for the current biennium. Decision Unit 280 restores funding for the Gifted and Talented Education Program, totaling approximately $5.2 million in each fiscal year of the upcoming biennium. This restores the funding that was reduced during the 31st special session and would result in total available funding for gifted and talented programs, totaling approximately $8.3 million in each year of the upcoming biennium. Again, the Gifted and Talented Program funding is recommended in a decision unit later in our presentation to transfer those funds to the state education funding account to be allocated through the pupil-centered funding plan, specifically in the weighted categories of funding. Slide 14 provides some information on the Gifted and Talented Program. It includes an overview of the program itself, identifies the students who participate in the program, the requirements for school districts with the use of the funding they receive from the state, as well as the allocated amount in the current biennium. Decision Unit E281 restores funding for special elementary counseling totaling $850,000 in each fiscal year of the upcoming biennium. And this restores funding that was previously reduced during the 31st special session. The funds allocated through the special elementary counseling grant are used to support counseling services for elementary students who are at risk of failure. Currently, each school district is reimbursed up to $50,000 per year to provide these services to elementary students who have been identified as being at risk of failure. Decision Unit E238 restores funding for the College and Career Readiness Diploma Program, totaling $1.3 million in each fiscal year. This restores the funding that was previously reduced during the 31st special session. This funding is used to support schools in supporting and providing CTE programs to their students, as well as assessments, credentials, certificates, and certifications, which would all allow a student to receive a college and career readiness diploma. Decision Unit 284 restores funding for the adult education program, totaling approximately $1.2 million in each fiscal year. This restores the funding that was previously reduced during the 31st special session and ensures that the state meets its maintenance of effort requirement for its federal grants that serve adult education. The total funding that would be available during the next biennium would total approximately $19.3 million in each fiscal year. These funds are used to provide opportunities to individuals who are 18 years old and older who do not have a high school diploma and are not currently enrolled in a public school, or 17-year-olds who are enrolled in an alternative education program to earn an adult high school diploma, if the school district determines that these students would benefit from these options. Decision Unit E285 restores funding for career and technical education, totaling $1 million in each fiscal year. This would restore the funding that was reduced during the 31st special session, and it would allow the state to continue to meet its federal maintenance of effort requirements for the Perkins Grant. We would note for the benefit of the subcommittee that the Department of Education requested and was approved for a one-time waiver of the maintenance of effort requirement in fiscal year 2021, based on the reduction that was made during the 31st special session. The total funding that would be available for the state general fund contribution towards the maintenance of effort for career and technical education would total approximately $13.5 million in each fiscal year. Decision Unit E286 restores funding for Jobs for America's graduates, totaling $252,000 in each fiscal year, which restores a portion of the reduction that was made during the 31st special session. The reductions made during the 31st special session totaled $588,000 in fiscal year 21. With the restoration of some of the funding that was previously reduced, there would be a total of approximately $3.9 million available in each fiscal year to support the ongoing work for Jobs for America's graduates. This program helps students who are at risk of not graduating stay in school and graduate. It teaches workplace readiness skills and provides employment services to their students. And they also assist with enrollment in post-secondary education or enlistment into the military. The funding that is provided to JAG has a matching requirement, so that for every dollar received in general fund, they're also working to obtain private dollars in an equivalent amount. Decision Unit E287 restores funding for the Educational Leadership Program, totaling $100,000 in each fiscal year. The funding was reduced during the 31st special session, totaling $300,000 in fiscal year 2021. So this is a partial restoration of that previous reduction. With the restoration, a total of $300,000 would be available for educational leadership programs in the upcoming biennium. These programs are provided through the Clark County Public Education Foundation. for the implementation and operation of educational leadership programs. Similar to the JAG program, expenditures of these funds are contingent upon the receipt of matching funds. Decision Unit E688 reduces funding to a variety of programs included within budget account 2699. Overall, the decision unit totals approximately $899,000 in each fiscal year, and the impacted programs are the Nevada Institute on Teaching and Educator Preparation, the Teacher and Nursing Certification Reimbursement, reimbursement for counselor certifications, and salary increments for speech pathologists. I would note that with these reductions, there would be no funding available to continue the Nevada Institute on Teaching and Educator Preparation program for the upcoming biennium using general fund dollars. There would still be approximately $47,000 available to reimburse teachers and nurses who attain national certification. Counselor certification would have approximately $588,000 available in each year of the upcoming biennium, and the incremental salary adjustments for speech pathologists would continue to have approximately $463,000 available. Decision Unit E916 transfers the funding for the Gifted and Talented program to the State Education Funding Account. As I previously noted, these funds are recommended to be transferred so that they can be allocated through the pupil-centered funding plan, specifically through the weighted funding for gifted and talented students. Decision Unit E947 transfers funding from several state-funded grant programs to the State Education Funding Account, including funding for Read by Grade 3, advanced placement exams, LEA library books, computer education and technology, special education counseling, and college and career readiness diploma incentives. These transfers would total $8,274,000 in each fiscal year, and the funding would be allocated through the statewide base per pupil funding amounts. The next slide again summarizes the funding that would be transferred out of this budget account into the state education funding account, as well as the funding that would continue to be accounted for and allocated through this budget account. As we have discussed in previous budget hearings, I would like to remind the members of the subcommittee that when the Department of Education and the Commission on School Funding worked to identify which state-funded grant programs should be allocated through the pupil-centered funding plan, the process looked at each program and activity individually, and a decision was made that any programs that would directly benefit a teacher in terms of salary or incentive reimbursement for exams taken would not be allocated on a per pupil basis through the pupil-centered funding plan, because many of those incentives are available to specific teachers or specific groups of teachers. Similarly, the department looked at programs that benefited students, and if the end result of the program was to serve students throughout our education system, those state-funded grant programs were recommended for inclusion in the methodology of allocating through the pupil-centered funding plan. With that, we would be happy to answer questions from the subcommittee on budget account 2699.
Thank you very much for that presentation. And there are questions, and I think we'll start with Chair Carlton. Would you like to go ahead?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So thank you very much for the presentation. That gave us a lot of information to work from. I think my first question is going to be on the educational leadership, E287. But I do have some other questions on CTE and the college and career readiness, but I'll ask mine and then I'll wait to see what other folks have to ask. So with the change in funding and the recommended reduced funding on this, what do we think the impacts on the operation of the educational leadership program will be?
Heidi Hartz for the record. When the funding was initially recommended for reduction during the 31st special session, that was a very difficult decision to make, as were all of the decisions. We are appreciative that the governor has included the restoration of some of the funding for the purposes of educational leadership and specifically for the services provided through the Clark County Public Education Foundation. The department would continue to work with all of our current subrecipients where there are budget reductions contemplated to identify if there are other sources of funding that can be used to ensure continuity of services.
Is there a list of services that you have that would be the ones that would not be provided because of the reduction? Or is everyone going to take a little bit of a haircut across all the services?
Heidi Hartz for the record. I believe that the department would look to the Clark County Public Education Foundation to identify which services they believe are most important to be continued or which services could be offered in a different format or at a different level to continue to meet the needs of their goals and objectives.
So the Public Education Foundation would make this decision?
Heidi Hartz for the record. They'd make the recommendation in collaboration with the Department of Education. I apologize.
Okay. I think I'm going to have a few follow-ups on that to make sure that I have a full picture on that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You are welcome, and we can come back to you if need be. So I'm going to jump in here really quick because I have an adult education question. So given that significant drop in the reported enrollment, why is the adult education diploma program recommended for a budget restoration of $1 million in each year in the future biennium?
Heidi Hartz for the record. In order for the state to continue to meet its maintenance of effort requirement for federal funds that are also used for adult education, we need to maintain our current general fund support for these activities. So the restoration of the approximately $1.2 million in each fiscal year will ensure that we meet that maintenance of effort requirement.
Okay, thank you. And then following that, would you tell me how would that general fund then appropriation of the $1 million each year in the next biennium be utilized to improve or expand that career and tech program?
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, Superintendent Ebert, the team has been working diligently with all of the programs across the entire state for the adult education. We did 2 years ago see a dip, but we are seeing an increase in the awards of diplomas, adult diplomas. And so we expect that to continue.
Okay, I see that Senator Severs-Gansert has a question.
Thank you, Chair Dondera-Loop. So I wanted to circle to the Read by Third Grade program, the Read by 3 program. And so it looks like the funding was restored in E277, but then it was cut in the E686. So the net is, instead of having about 31.4 million a year, we've got roughly like 14.7 or $8 million a year. Is that correct?
Heidi Hartz for the record. Yes, that is correct.
Okay. And then, we talk about gifted and talented and English language learners and low income. There's a weight, but it sounded like you were able to identify about 114,000 students who are not at grade level for literacy, but we don't have any weights, right? So we're cutting the program, and then there's really no weights, even though it's getting put into the pupil-centered funding plan. Is that right?
Heidi Hartz for the record. Currently, the pupil-centered funding plan includes 3 weighted categories: students who are English learners, students who are designated at being at risk, and students who are gifted and talented. The Commission on School Funding, as well as the governor and the legislature, all have opportunities, according to Senate Bill 543, to recommend additional categories of weighting if they deem that to be necessary and certainly in the best interest of our students. So the funding that has previously been allocated at one point in time through a competitive process and most recently through a non-competitive process for Read by Grade 3 is recommended to be transferred into the state education funding account and allocated through the pupil-centered funding plan as part of the per pupil funding amount. While the funding allocation will change, the programs and services and the intent of our state to ensure that our students are reading at grade level will all remain. There's no changes recommended in statute to the provisions that would require elementary school principals to identify a literacy specialist at each elementary school, and those literacy specialists will still continue to provide professional development, technical assistance, support, and services to ensure that the students in their schools are reading at grade level.
Would you please let me know what the weights are for the English learners and the at-risk? I think today you said the gifted and talented program is 0.14. Would you mind sharing the weights for those?
Heidi Hartz for the record. When the Commission on School Funding identified the weights that served as the base in the development of the pupil-centered funding plan, they looked at the general fund revenues that had been appropriated for fiscal year 20 and divided that by the number of students to be served. That generated a weight of 2.0 for English learners, a weight of 0.03 for at-risk students, and a weight of 0.12 for gifted and talented students. The Commission on School Funding also identified target weights, which would facilitate the allocation of additional funds to the weights when additional funding became available. The weights that are currently reflected in the governor's recommended budget are less or different than what I just indicated. When the governor moved forward with the phased implementation of the pupil-centered funding plan, the goal was to maintain the amount of funding per pupil for those 3 weighted categories, so the dollar values remained unchanged. So English language learners are currently anticipated to receive an additional $1,485 per pupil. Schools serving students who are designated as being at risk are currently anticipated to receive an additional $253 per pupil. And students who are eligible for gifted and talented programming their school would receive an additional $854 per pupil.
Thank you. I guess it sounded like you were talking about weights of 2.0, 0.03, and 0.12 for the English learners at risk and gifted and talented, but then you just use dollars. Do those dollars translate to weights, or do they get the weight and then money on top of that?
Heidi Hartz for the record. In the pupil-centered funding plan, as prescribed by Senate Bill 543, the weights are applied to the statewide base per pupil funding amount, and that generates a specific per pupil dollar amount that would go to the school where pupils are estimated to be enrolled during a school year, so that those schools can provide the services that those students are eligible to receive.
Okay, so I guess I'm still confused. So the English learners you'd said was a 2.0, but then you said $1,845. Are those equivalent?
Heidi Hartz for the record. I wanted to first clarify that when the Commission on School Funding recommended the initial weights, they were looking at all funds appropriated in fiscal year 2022, and that equated to a dollar value. By taking the total available general funds and dividing it by the number of students who were anticipated to be served in that fiscal year. The governor's recommended budget includes weighted funding for those 3 categories of students. The weights would be different because the amount of funding included in the pupil-centered funding plan with phased implementation, and therefore the statewide base per pupil funding amount would be less than if we were looking at full implementation. The governor's recommended budget shifts the weights in fiscal years 22 and 23. However, the weights are shifted in a way that ensures that the per pupil funding amount remains constant.
Thank you. You know, I think I'd like to just follow up with you offline because I don't want to take the committee's time to go through this. I want to make sure the numbers match up and understand the weighting better. So thank you for this.
Thank you very much. I believe Assemblywoman Teresa Benitez Thompson has questions, please.
Madam Chair, I believe she's lost connection for a moment. I'm not seeing her. So if you wanted to move on to the next person and then go back to her, I think she's trying to get back in. Okay.
All righty, let me just see where we were in the questions. Then we'll go on to Assemblywoman Gorlow, please.
Thank you, Chair Dondera-Loop. I had a quick question about how the total proposed budget reductions, especially those reductions that would eliminate funding for the grant programs, impact the ability of schools to provide services and supports to students and teachers.
Heidi Hartz for the record. As is true for any program or service administered by the state, reductions will always have an impact. And the reductions in education are no different. Any reduction will have an impact on our students. As we have presented previously, we are very fortunate at this point in time that the reductions that have been recommended in the governor's budget so that he could comply with the requirement to submit a balanced budget to the legislature based on the best thinking in the state in January of this year is that we do have access to federal funds. And so that could create an opportunity for federal funds to be invested in a way that allows us to continue to meet the needs of our students and teachers. It also gives the state an opportunity to invest in education in innovative ways in light of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Assemblywoman Carlton, follow-up.
And thank you, Madam Chair. So I guess I'd like to go back to the college and career readiness, which started last session. And then I'm trying to figure out how that meshes with JAG. So in the college and career readiness, the work-based learning, you had said that there were grants to nonprofits on that. So since this is kind of a newer one for us, could you expand upon that a little bit more? And then I believe I have a question about JAG, but I'm just trying to figure out why we would have two programs that are kind of aimed in the same direction.
Heidi Hartz for the record. Based on my review of the decisions from the 2019 legislative session that resulted in a portion of the funds for the College and Career Readiness Program being specifically designated for competitive grants to school districts, charter schools, and nonprofit organizations to develop and implement work-based learning programs. It appears that that was a pilot project to allow the development of these programs within a school setting, whereas the programs and services provided through JAG are a specific group of students who tend to be at risk of not graduating from high school. It appears that the pilot projects that were funded with the $750,000 were targeted at all students.
Okay, so, but it would seem to me that the work that JAG is trying to accomplish is also basically the same work that the work-based learning is. And it may just be because when I went through the expanded program narrative and then went through some of the line items, I couldn't quite fit them together. So if the career readiness and the work-based learning seems to be working well. It seems like those two programs should sort of blend together to make sure that the kids who need it the most get the resources that they need.
Superintendent Ebert, for the record, thank you, Chair Carlton. Yes, all of those funds are meeting children's need at the end of the day. And so how do we make sure that, and in this instance, we have made sure across our state that we're not being duplicative in the spending of the funds, but that they complement each other and meet the intended purpose of the allocation, what has been allocated. So the $750,000 specifically for all children reaching the college and career readiness diploma, which we were very proud in our data this last year increased. I almost want to say 15% off the top of my head, but I'll have to go back and look. And so you have that data, and then you have the JAG data where they too, especially during the pandemic, went and reached out, went to student homes to make sure that they had devices, connectivity, social emotional supports within families. So I guess to your question and framing, yes, in service of children, while ensuring that there's no overlap in those services that have been provided through the state.
And thank you very much, Superintendent. So I guess what I would like to get, and if I already have it, I apologize. I know we shouldn't be asking for information too many times, but if there's a list of the nonprofits that received the money in the college and career readiness so that we can kind of overlay that with the other work that other folks are doing, we're always curious how the dollars are being distributed into the community to see what work is being done. So if that's already been provided, I apologize for asking a second time, but if it hasn't, if you could provide that to our staff, please, so that we can kind of fit it all together. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. I think Senator Keffer has a question.
Yes, thank you so much. I wanted to follow up quickly on the issue over adult education. And I think Ms. Hartz indicated that we needed to restore this $1 million a year because of our maintenance of effort requirement. But it doesn't sound like we actually need the money for actually educating students. So is there a way to potentially use some of the expenditures perhaps put out by the districts to meet that MOE? Rather than us having to appropriate it with the expectation that it's just going to revert at the end of the year or biennium?
Heidi Hartz for the record. In working with our program staff, we do believe that these funds will be expended moving forward. And we are happy to circle back and revisit the federal requirements for the maintenance of effort to ensure who can provide maintenance of effort dollars and support and services. I do believe that we already rely on our subrecipients, both school districts and other agencies and organizations, to provide in-kind match to many of our federal grants in adult education. So I'll be happy to circle back to see if there remains any capacity left at that level.
Maybe I misunderstood what you had meant by saying that we only needed it to maintain MOE. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator Ratty.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to dig in a little bit more on the gifted and talented weight. If I'm understanding correctly, we've got it at a weight of 0.14 compared to what the consultant recommended at 0.05. So could you just talk about that a little bit more?
Heidi Hartz for the record. When the Commission on School Funding looked at the amount of funding that was available, appropriated by the legislature for fiscal year 2020, divided by the number of students who were anticipated to receive those services, it generated a weight of 0.12. When identifying what the target weights should be, the Commission on School Funding did make the recommendation that in the long term, the target weight should be 0.14. That was a recommendation that the Commission on School Funding put forward because they recognize that many school districts are contributing funds to support additional programs and services to to students who receive gifted and talented programming. And so they were hopeful that additional dollars would become available to support those specific programs and services.
Okay. And then just one follow-up on Read by 3. I'm not clear if you specifically got to so we expanded it to all 17 school districts and charter schools. So how many additional students were provided literacy supports in the current model in fiscal year 2020?
Heidi Hartz, for the record, we went back and looked at the data that we have acquired since funding became available. The first year that funding was available was the academic year 2015-16. The state had $4.8 million available. Awards at that point were issued on a competitive basis. 64 schools received funding and 21,000 students were served. In the 2016-17 and 2017-18 school years, approximately $20 to $22 million were available for allocation, and we served roughly 300 schools and a range of 113,000 to 186,000 students. Most recently, in the 2018-19 school year, we had $20 million available for allocation, which resulted in funding for 291 schools and a total of 192,000 students being served. So currently, all school districts are receiving funding, which is based on a literacy strategist average salary of approximately $71,000 per year. We're serving 428 schools and 222,000 students.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. And I believe Assemblywoman Hadagi has a question.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And I'm going to apologize if this was already answered, but I just walked in from a bill presentation. Or if I believe I'm on the right budget, but I have questions regarding the categorical grant funding. Now, I know that in this budget, some of the categorical programs are recommended to be transferred into the state education funding account, but some of them aren't. So can you explain to me why?
Heidi Hartz, for the record, I'd be happy to. So when the Department of Education and the Commission on School Funding began working on the pupil-centered funding plan and identifying specifically what revenues should be allocated through the pupil-centered funding plan, we reviewed each state categorical grant program, and we immediately removed those programs that targeted or incentives that targeted teachers with respect to an incentive, a reimbursement for acquisition of a national certification, or a salary adjustment due to a specific position type or services being provided by that teacher. We also removed any program that appeared to really be focused on not all teachers, only selected teachers. We then looked at the remaining programs, and if those programs and services were targeted at a school or at the students specifically in a school, then they were recommended to be transferred. The funding was recommended to be transferred to the state education funding account and allocated through the pupil-centered funding plan. Again, I want to just remind the subcommittee that Senate Bill 543 does not remove any of the programmatic expectations or requirements that are currently included in statute. The only thing that would change is the process by which the funding is allocated. And a benefit to allocating many of these state-funded grants through the pupil-centered funding plan is that school districts can have some confidence and continuity in what their funding levels might be from one year to the next. They don't need to go through a competitive grant process or wait for the Department of Education to go through a formulaic distribution process. Anytime we administer a state grant-funded program, that's done through a sub-grant agreement. And so school districts have to develop individual proposals and budgets for those sub-grant agreements. They then need to request reimbursement from the Department of Education, ideally on a monthly basis, for the services that they have provided. When funds are allocated through the pupil-centered funding plan, for those activities that we've recommended for inclusion in the state education fund and allocation through the funding model, subgrants won't be necessary. The funding will be made available to school districts as part of their monthly payment from the state on that per pupil funding amount.
Thank you, Ms. Hartson. Just, Madam Chair, just follow up because I took notes and I can't read my own writing now.
Absolutely.
So that was, you said you removed the programs that were like not student focused, so like the teacher incentives, reimbursements, and there was one other one that you listed that I didn't get to write down. It was salary.
So there'll be salary adjustments for specific educational personnel, reimbursements for attainment of national certifications that are allowed in statute, and then incentives for specific groups of teachers or specifically to teachers.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Assemblywoman. Any additional questions on this particular account? All right, seeing none, we will move to the.
Madam Chair, if I could.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
absolutely, I'm sorry.
Couldn't find the button fast enough. I believe the one that I had a follow-up on that no one asked on was the actual JAG program itself. We talked about it in reference to college and career readiness, but not actual JAG programs. So I know we've had numerous conversations about this program in the last couple of biennia, and just wanted to make sure that I understood, and Ms. Hartz alluded to it, about the delivery model, how they worked through the pandemic. We had come up with a scheme last time of providing a certain amount, having them match the money, and then come back to the legislature for the rest. That was kind of an accountability measure that we put in. So I want to understand exactly how they adapted, what's actually in the base, and I'm assuming we're going to fund it sort of the same ways we did last time to make sure that we have that accountability measure. So if we could address that, and then if there's any other questions, I'll be happy to yield.
Heidi Hartz for the record. We have some information that JAG provided that indicated that when the COVID-19 pandemic changed the way that our students were attending school, that they immediately worked with all of their staff and devised a plan to reach out to their students. They conducted wellness checks for each of their students. They tried to identify any areas of concern or need for their students, and then worked with their students and families to identify how those needs could be addressed. Examples of some of the needs that they addressed were working with a community partner to provide virtual tutoring sessions for their students across the state. They also worked with Cox Communication to make sure that their students had the opportunity to apply for free internet services. They also noted that because they do have JAG specialists embedded in schools across the state, that they were allowed to continue to work with students through their schools to provide instruction learning where it was possible, and to support hybrid and distance learning in other school districts. So the instructors were able to continue their ability to teach their students through JAG virtually if the schools were on a virtual platform. They really focused in on making sure that their students felt connected to school and to their community, and looked at activities that would help them to continue to be successful in high school, and also to ensure that they were anticipating their post-high school activities, whether that was finding a high-paying job, enrolling in college, or enlisting in the military.
Superintendent Ebert for the record. We also have asked, and I am more than happy to provide this body reports, especially during the shift, on not only, did they shift, but were there outcomes from those shifts. So I'm more than happy to provide those reports. We meet with them quite frequently to make sure that the students are on track. The last report that we received with the students on track and the percentage of students graduating from the program is very similar to our CTE programs, which has been 97%. But I will follow up with documentation to this body for you.
Heidi Hartz, for the record, the question was asked, how much funding was budgeted for JAG in the upcoming biennium and the base budget? The base budget includes $3.6 million in each fiscal year, with the addition of the restoration of funding totaling approximately $252,000. Their total funding would be $3.9 million in each fiscal year. And we fully anticipated the requirements for the match to remain in place. I would note that JAG has expressed some concern with their ability to generate private dollars. They've indicated that many of their donors are investing in COVID-19 related activities and needs within their communities. And so it's making it a little bit more difficult for them to acquire additional donations to match the general fund dollars that they have received from the state.
And thank you very much, Ms. Hartz. And you confirmed what my thought was, that the match portion ended up being built into the base, and I'm not sure that was ever the intention. So we can have further discussions about that. That was their go out and get the match. But if we build that into the base and then they match again, it just becomes exponential. So I think we need to have a conversation about that. And I can totally understand the world of nonprofit, because a lot of us that serve or participate in nonprofits are all facing the same struggles over the next couple of years. So I do appreciate that it is out there. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. And I think my flight controller skills aren't as good as I thought. And Assemblywoman Teresa Benitez Thompson, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Madam Chairwoman. Your flight skills are amazing. Please don't ever say anything like that on the record. You're amazing. So this is kind of the same statement I make every 2 years when it comes to these kinds of budgets, that we love the nonprofits and we value the work that they do, but that I continue to remain concerned when we kind of just talk about the opportunity cost of the dollars that go to nonprofits, especially in some of the educational sectors from the state general fund, versus that opportunity cost is if those dollars were invested right into educational funds. The idea that, the 3.9 million straight into education, ideally, if we're funding it right, means that we don't need the nonprofits to be doing the work for us, because we're just in fact funding the schools to do it. So I kind of say that every 2 years, just to say, before we have the concern about making sure that nonprofits are healthy and whole, that we should in fact start with making sure these our own state general fund budgets are healthy and whole. So I say that a lot. That's no surprise. I guess what I would say specifically to this nonprofit, and it's hard because nonprofits do good work. I don't think that's the question, but we were concerned about a nonprofit that is overly reliant on state general funds. And that was the concern last time. And then the concern this time is, once again, because if they're overly reliant on state general funds and having trouble raising in the private sector, that means when we're in a position of having to look at cuts in foster care and cuts in aging and disability services and cuts in education, that we have this added burden of a responsibility of keeping an entity that is not within state government whole as well. And so then if we have to make cuts here, then the whole nonprofit is falling down. And so that overly reliance on one funding source is just something that I always worry about. And the more we increase the funding, the more we're encouraging that. And so I just I kind of have a little bit of a fundamental problem with that. I really don't think that, I think that the nonprofit should be the very last in line if and when there's extra money, but not built in as if they are as essential as our primary focus of funding the rest of these budgets. So that's just, I guess, what I'll put out there. Thanks.
Thank you, Assemblywoman. And Assemblywoman Gorlow, did you have a follow-up?
And I'm hoping that, and she can help me find some documents, because whether it's in my policy committees or now the money committees, I get a lot of great information on the program and what it's supposed to do, but I'm not seeing a lot of the evaluation. I do appreciate, I believe Superintendent Ebert did mention that JAG had a 97% grad rate, but I'm wondering where I might be able to find more information on who is actually participating in these programs, breaking down between genders, race, ethnicities, a little bit more information on if they feel that they're helping them, maybe their surveys. But I'd love to see a little bit more information, and I'm hoping that it is out there, and I'd appreciate it if it is, if you could point me in the right direction, because I've looked in my files here in my office, back at home. I'm not finding evaluations on these. We do get some numbers on so many students are receiving the services, but not so much of how much they're improving compared to other states, compared to their peers that might not have received the services. So basically, where can I find that information? Thank you.
Thank you, Superintendent Ebert. For the record, we will work with, there are documents that we have, but we make sure that you have the complete information. And then if there's a specific appointment that you would like to set up directly with JAG, we can help facilitate that as well.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you kindly. And I believe Senator Keffer has a follow-up as well.
I appreciate that, Madam Chair. I recognize that all of the statutory provisions surrounding these categorical programs are remaining in place. But I think what I worry about, sort of big picture, is whether districts are going to have the resources under this proposal to actually do that. As I recall from, I think, our first, the overview hearing in January, this budget was originally constructed based on running the Nevada plan, right, to figure out how much funding we needed to include, and then converting it into this model. And the notes that we received indicated that the actual base per pupil funding amount in that model was between this year and next year, a reduction of $132. I understand that doesn't incorporate everything, but if we're taking what the categorical funds that we were expecting districts to spend on specific things, be it read by 3, social workers, whatever it might be, bringing it into a reduced level of base. What kind of feedback are we getting from districts as to whether they're actually going to have the resources to do what the statute tells them to under this new model?
Superintendent Ebert, for the record, thank you, Senator Keffer, for that question. What I would tell you is that we, as a state, continue to strive to identify additional funds. We've been very successful in acquiring grant funds over the years, very appreciative of the state funds that have been made available. I believe the whole purpose for actually spinning up Senate Bill 543, and thank you all again for voting it in and the governor signing it, is we as a state we appreciate and understand what education does for all of our children. The fact of the matter is we know we all can be doing better. And identifying stable funding to get where we're at, where we want to be, and optimal funding on top of that is a goal that we have. And I am blessed that the commission now, again, is looking at the optimal funding piece. If you were to ask anyone in education right now, is it enough? They will tell you no. We have some of the largest class sizes in the nation. So I hear you in relation to the conversation about the other entities and as well as the Assemblywoman asking about, what is our goal? How are we focusing and laser in on the most important components of the work for our children? And each of these decisions and conversations are not that we have are difficult ones, but I think that all of us working together, we will get to the other side. We will see funding stabilize for education, and we will see higher gains through that in our student outcomes.
Thank you, Madam Superintendent. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Okay, now I'll see if anyone has any additional questions. Maybe last call. I don't see anyone. All right, Superintendent Ebert and Deputy Director Hartz, we can move on to the School Remediation Trust Fund 2615. Please go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you. For the record, Heidi Hartz. As you indicated, the next budget account for your consideration today is budget account 2615, the School Remediation Trust Fund. The funds in this budget account support improvement plans developed by school districts to improve student achievement. Examples of funding include incentives for new teachers, incentives for teachers teaching at Title I or underperforming schools, funding for additional services for English learners, such as Zoom, and additional funds for Victory Schools, as well as the Nevada 21 technology program. Decision Unit E275 restores funding for incentives for new and transfer teachers at Title I schools. The amount of the restoration is $2.5 million in each fiscal year. This would restore the funding that was previously reduced during the special session. This would result in $1.25 million each for new teachers and transfer teachers at Title I or underperforming schools, as included in the governor's recommended budget. Decision Unit E276 restores a portion of the block grant funds. During the 31st special session, these block grant funds, which were previously appropriated through Senate Bill 551, were reduced by approximately $1 million in fiscal year 21. This decision unit restores those funds moving forward. Decision Unit E929 transfers the funding that I just spoke to about the additional funds for the operation of school districts out of this budget account and into the distributive school account. The legislative intent was that these funds would be allocated through the Nevada plan and the distributive school account moving forward. Because we are moving forward with implementation of the pupil-centered funding plan in accordance with Senate Bill 543. There is a decision unit in the distributive school account, budget account 2610, that in turn transfers these funds to the state education funding account for allocation through the pupil-centered funding plan. Madam Chair, that is the extent of our slides for this budget account, and we'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to start with Assemblywoman Gorlow.
Thank you, Chair. I had a quick question. If the funding for the teacher incentive programs were transferred to the pupil-centered funding plan, what issues, if any, would school districts experience if teacher incentives were funded with base per pupil funding to recruit and retain qualified teachers at underperforming schools?
Heidi Hartz, for the record. If the funding that's currently designated as an incentive for teachers at a Title I school or an underperforming school were to be allocated through the pupil-centered funding plan, while it would increase the statewide base per pupil funding amount, it could make it difficult or uncertain that the funding would It would then be incumbent upon each school district to ensure that those incentives are allocated to those schools, Title I schools or underperforming schools, so that teachers could receive the incentive to which they are intended. Currently, it's easier or perhaps more transparent if we track those funds from the Department of Education specifically to the school district and down to the school level to know that the eligible teachers are receiving the incentives.
Okay, thank you.
Again, these incentives target specifically the teacher who are working at those schools.
And can you talk just a little bit about how effective those incentive payments are for new or transferred teachers in the recruitment or retention of qualified teachers?
Thank you, Assemblywoman Garler. Superintendent Ebert, for the record. So with those funds, the components of that grant, as you are aware, I'm sure, that the teachers actually stay at those schools and not transfer out for a specific period of time. The school districts have reported great success. I will tell you that specifically in Clark County School District, they actually doubled down with additional funds to incentivize teachers to maintain status at those schools. And beyond that, if there's other specific data, I would need to provide that to you. I don't have it in front of me right at this time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I believe Senator Ratty, please.
Thank you, Chair. Could you tell me how it was determined that the funding for the supplemental support block grant should be recommended for restoration as opposed to some of the other things we cut during the special session?
Heidi Hartz, for the record. I believe that the governor included this recommendation in his budget in an effort to restore the funds that were added at the end of the 2019 legislative session in recognition of the increased costs of operating our schools statewide.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I believe that Assemblywoman Hadaki.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I have a similar question to my last question too. I just want to see if you could walk me through how you prioritized what programs should be restored.
Thank you for the question, Superintendent Ebert, for the record. This entire process was not done in a silo. We actually worked with all 17 school district superintendents as well as the state public charter school authority. So these exercises are difficult, but we did it in collaboration with those that are working directly with our students on a daily basis.
Okay, I mean, that kind of answers who you worked with, but that doesn't answer my question about how you guys got to prioritizing which programs would be restored. So like what metrics or what weights did you use when discussing what programs would actually be restored?
Thank you. So yes, we do. I apologize. We do use data in making those determinations, not just coffee clutch around a table. So we do have data that we look at in reviewing each and every one of those programs. If there's a specific program that you would like us to dive in on data, I'm more than happy to do so.
I guess maybe you could just share with our staff so they could share with us some of the data points, like what were you guys looking at when determining which program would be restored, over another one? So like what were the weights you were looking at is really what I'm trying to get at. But if you could just get that to our staff so they could share it to committee staff so they could share it with us, that would be great. And then I'll just gonna move on to my next question. The English, the ELL program, very near and dear to my heart. So I just kind of want to walk you through if you guys have given any thought into will the program be impacted if it's transferred over to the education savings account?
Heidi Hartz, for the record. So as you have noted, The funding that was previously allocated for Zoom services will be allocated, is recommended to be allocated through the pupil-centered funding plan, specifically to the weighted category for English language learners. Currently, these services are provided on a school basis, and through the pupil-centered funding plan, the services would now be available to all students. So this will result in a change in the way the program is administered. However, it will allow all students who are designated as English learners to receive access to the same supports and services that previously may not have been available to all students.
Thank you, Ms. Hartz. And then just one last question, Madam Chair, and it's along the same line. So just with the same thing with the Victory schools, will the program be impacted by moving it over? The at-risk weight?
Heidi Hartz, for the record, you're correct. The response is very similar because the questions are very similar. So previously, Victory services were provided through designated schools, and now we have the opportunity to provide those same services to all students who have been designated as being at risk and who would benefit from those additional supports and services.
Thank you, Ms. Hartz, and thank you, Madam Chair. That's all the questions I had.
Okay, Assemblywoman Teresa or Benitez Thompson, did you have a question? Or did you step out?
I did. My question is on the recommended transfer of funding for the Nevada 21 Ready program. If that's okay, Madam Chair.
Please.
Perfect. And so on this program, I just wanted to know, really just for kind of the legislative record, what assurances there would be that school districts will continue to fund laptops and professional development with their base per pupil funding at the Nevada Ready 21 technology program funding were transferred to support the modified pupil-centered funding plan. And I know I've heard that that there's no undoing or striking of language in statute regarding RAM requirements. And so I just wanted to see if that was the same response for this as well.
Heidi Hartz, for the record, the Nevada Ready 21 technology program has been incredibly successful. And in fact, the program staff have shared that they're very proud that Nevada is actually leading the nation for our computer science education initiatives. In fact, we are fourth in the nation for having achieved many of the national policies that have been established. I do believe that all of our school districts and the State Public Charter School Authority are very committed to continuing to invest in technology and all of the technological advances that we have benefited from during the last year as we have risen to meet the challenges that have been provided to our schools as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I personally believe that school districts are very closely monitoring all of the devices that they are buying and are very well aware of the fact that there will be ongoing replacement costs, not only as devices are broken or damaged, but as they reach their end of life cycle.
I appreciate that. So knowing now that these dollars will go into a pool of money that's going to be allowed for unrestricted purposes, we will just know then, I guess, by reports at the end of each biennium back from the school districts about whether or not they are indeed replacing devices as they get broken or at the end of their useful life cycle, or if they're replacing them kind of at what ratio, or if they're behind. We'll still have a way to capture that data.
Thank you. For the record, Superintendent Ebert, I would like to make a special asterisk on this one. With the pandemic, all of the school districts across the state acquired hundreds of thousands of devices for our students. A majority of those funds, thank you again, you allocated through the special session, AB3, Also, additional ESSER dollars from the federal government were provided. So I want to make sure there's not a thought process that Nevada Ready 21, now the funds that were specifically allocated to a specific set of schools. This last year, it was 4 schools, I believe, that we were able to provide funds for. We now have provided devices across the entire state. Again, the infusion of funds coming from the federal government to support that. Those devices have a lifespan anywhere between 3 and 4 years. So within the next 3 and 4 years, I wouldn't want to have the body come back and say, the department was on the record, Nevada Ready 21, everybody's good, because it will not be, unless the funds are allocated to create a systemic path forward for all students in a digital learning environment. We know that we're on a trajectory in 4 years from now, 3 to 4 years from now, where we will need to see additional funds to maintain the level that we currently have today.
Thank you. And I really actually appreciate that. I think that's really good for the legislative record, because there will be a point down the road where they look back and they say, okay, we have these cohort of technology that went out and went online at the same time, which means we're going to have a cohort of technology, coming to its end of its useful life at the same time. And it'll be quite a big impact. And I think at that time, legislators will say, well, you know what, we're giving those dollars to school districts. They're in an unrestricted fund. Our expectation would be that they plan for that end of life and are budgeting with a piece of this money. But it'll be good to, I won't be around to have that complicated conversation, but at some point, legislators down the road can know that we are acknowledging that will probably be a discussion that happens.
Thank you very much. I believe Senator Keffer had a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll stop after this one, I promise. So I wanted to just understand that as we move away from the school-based programs with Zoom and Victory into the distributed model where we're supporting every child with a certain dollar figure, I just want to make sure do you know what that's doing to the weights? I mean, it looks to me from where we are today to what will be implemented, it looks like we're currently serving about 60% of people who may be eligible for ELL programs, but only like 10% maybe of at-risk eligible kids with current Victory programming or funding. So do you have a weight differential between where we are now based on the students we're serving versus where we are when we start trying to target all kids?
Thank you, Senator Keffer, Joan Ebert, for the record. So I think what we've experienced through this whole conversation, and I'm thankful for it, because we are making a shift from the Nevada plan to the pupil-centered funding plan. And just like being an educator, we know that you have to have many times a conversation and sometimes explain it in different ways. So I'll be brief and oversimplify, and hopefully it will mark. And if it doesn't, please tell me to express in another way. That being said, we have a set of funds that have been provided traditionally for education in our state. Now that we're shifting to the pupil-centered funding formula, we're taking things like Zoom and Victory, which were categoricals and only served a few students. It was very successful programs. And so that's why we're sitting here today, because that pilot, if you will, was Zoom and Victory saying, hey, if we actually fund education and fund these learners that we know require different resources, additional resources, extended school day, reading centers, all those best practices, will we see an increase? Because it's a conversation that we've had within our state of we can achieve if we have additional dollars. So yay, we've proven that. the educators in our state have done a phenomenal job, and our children are achieving, as we pointed out in the slide deck. As we're shifting now, and we want to make sure that not just these few schools in our state receive the dollars and few students, because we know ELL students exist in every single school district in our state and many schools. So how do we make sure that those resources are now provided to all of the ELL students? Well, what we've done is taken those dollars that are already outlined in those programs like Zoom and put them toward that category, which is now a weighted category. The dollars that are available, I think this goes to what Senator Seaver-Ganser was asking earlier, those dollars don't necessarily meet the target weight. And so that's where you see the differences. To your specific question, I don't have in front of me right this second what those conversion between those dollars would be. More than happy to run those for you. But I think that's what people are probably wondering about and where these questions are coming from. You know, how come we're not hitting those targets? Does it hit all of the children across the state? Yes, those dollars now will flow to each of those students that are identified in those categories, but they're based on the dollars that are currently available today.
Yeah, thank you. I certainly appreciate that. I think the purpose of my question is to sort of compound what you're saying, is that we've had success in these programs, but they're at a certain weight, right? for whatever segment of the population we've been serving, and if we dilute that weight too dramatically, I worry that we're not going to be able to achieve the same outcomes. And I guess back to the point of the funding levels that would be necessary to achieve optimum weights across the entire universe of students. So that was the purpose of my question. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Senator Seavers-Gansert, I believe, had a question.
Thank you, Chair Don Darrell. So kind of following the same line, but a little bit different. If I recall, we've had about $430 million come down from the feds, which actually goes directly to the school districts. It doesn't go through the state. So it's not included in any of our numbers. Is there a way to create a chart or compile basically where those dollars are going? Because I know general fund is down, but at the same time, there's $403 million that will go to the various school districts. And it'd be interesting to sort of see cumulatively how that adds up and what the funding is, and categorize too. So if they are spending it on technology, if they're spending it on reading, if they're spending it on additional amounts for teachers. So if the money was actually categorized, not just there's another $403 million, but how's it being spent? And is it sort of helping to contribute to some of the goals, the mission and the goals that we have overall as a state? Thank you.
Heidi Hartz, for the record, we do have a table readily available within the Department of Education that tracks all of the federal emergency relief funds we have received related to COVID-19 and who the recipients of those funds are. It will take us some time to go back and review each subgrant to identify specifically how each school district has chosen to invest those dollars, but that we'd be happy to provide that information to your staff.
Thank you. That would be helpful, because while we are seeing some funds down in various categories, maybe the total funding isn't down like we're viewing it right now. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much. I don't believe we have any additional questions. And if not, we will move on to Budget 2698, School Safety. Please go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you, Heidi Hartz, for the record. The next budget account is Budget Account 2699, our school safety account. It does support funding for school districts intended to enhance the physical safety of our schools and the well-being of our students. More specifically, funding is allocated through this budget account for social and other licensed mental health workers, as well as school resource officers. And then we do support a contract through this budget account that gathers information through our school climate and social and emotional learning surveys. Thank you. Decision Unit E277 restores funding for the social worker program, totaling $720,000 in each fiscal year. And this restores some of the funding that was reduced during the 31st special session. Decision Unit E686 reduces the total funding available by approximately $1 million per fiscal year. And then Decision Unit E948 will transfer the funding for social workers to the state education funding account, budget account 2699. The total amount of funding that would be available for transfer totals $18 million in each fiscal year. Decision Unit E278 restores funding for school resource officers that were previously reduced during the 31st special session. The recommended restoration totals approximately $1.9 million in each fiscal year. Decision Unit E686 reduces the total funding by approximately $1.4 million in each fiscal year. Decision Unit E948 transfers that funding for school resource officers into the state education funding account. The amount available for transfer and allocation through the pupil-centered funding plan would total approximately $4 million in each fiscal year. This slide demonstrates that the funding that would be transferred out of this budget account and into the the state education funding account, and then what would remain to be funded through this budget account following that transfer would be the contract for the climate and social emotional learning surveys. With that, Madam Chair, we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. And I think we'll start with Senator Ratty.
Thank you, Chair. So what factors did the department consider when awarding the funding to the various school districts for this program?
Good morning. This is Christy McGill for the record, Director of the Office of Safety and Responsible Learning. And it's depending on... All right.
Much better. Much better. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Depending on the funding stream, for example, our school social work enhancement was based upon need, looking at our climate school data, discipline data, and working with the districts. Also on the school resource officers and school police officers, this too was identified with need, looking at discipline, violent, school survey data, and vulnerability. And lastly, the facility improvements, again, was based upon competitive and looking at a grant process based upon school safety audits.
Are you good, Senator Ratty? Okay.
I'm sorry. No, I do have a second question. I'm good with the answer to that question. I apologize.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
So how did the budget reductions in fiscal year 2020 and 2021 impact the school resource police officer program?
Heidi Hartz for the record. When the Department of Education and of course all state agencies were asked to look at general fund savings in fiscal year 20 and fiscal year 21, we worked closely with the superintendents of each school district and the state public charter school authority. The amounts recommended for reversion in fiscal year 20 and for reduction in fiscal year 2021, specific to social workers and school resource officers, were developed in consultation by school districts who indicated that they had either been able to hire staff at a lesser amount than expected, or they had experienced difficulty in filling those positions and the funds would not be expended.
Thank you.
Okay, we will go to Assemblyman Roberts. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the presentation this morning. So my question was more on the mental health workers and social workers that you talked about. I know during the last school year, we had some issues with mental health in regards to the pandemic. And I'm just curious how these workers assisted during that time and how do you think they'll move or assist going forward?
Christy McGill, for the record, Director of the Office of Safe and Respectful Learning. And the school-based mental health workers were essential in the epidemic and making sure they reached out and checked in with our students. As noted, we still have low ratios of school-based mental health professionals in our school districts. And so they were really stretched thin, but they were essential in making sure that students were connected. They will also be essential in the recovery and renewal phases of this pandemic as they help students and staff learn from what has happened and kind of build that resilience to move forward and to recover and renew.
So a quick follow-up, Madam Chair. Thank you for the answer. And I'm curious as to, you highlighted some of the reductions that may come, or maybe I'm ahead of myself in the budgets, but you had some reductions slated for both licensed mental health workers and school resource police officers over the next biennium. How is that going to impact both of those programs?
Heidi Hartz for the record. Certainly reductions impact every program that is offered through the Department of Education, and ultimately those reductions impact our students. As I mentioned previously for other programs, one of the ironic benefits that we have at this point in time are the emergency funds that we have received related to COVID-19. And many of those funds have come with the hope that they would be invested in getting our children back into school so that they can receive in-person education and services, but also to address learning loss and certainly not insignificantly to address their emerging mental health needs. So many of our school districts, I believe, are looking at how to invest those additional federal dollars to address those needs.
Thank you. So this could be restored by the various school districts and to take up some of the slack on this reduction. That's basically what you're saying.
Heidi Hartz for the record. I believe a lot of school districts, as I have taught to their chief financial officers, are looking at how they can augment the funds that would be available so that they can meet the mental health needs of their students with additional federal funds that they have received. Again, it's important to remember that these emergency federal funds will not be an ongoing source of funding, but they will help us navigate as we continue to respond and recover from the COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay. Thank you for the answer. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Assemblyman Hafen, do you have a question, please?
Thank you, Madam Chair. In my question goes along the lines with Assemblyman Roberts and Senator Gansert's line of questioning. During this pandemic, we've seen a very sad statistics when it comes to our students and their mental health and the increase in suicides. And so I have some concerns with the reduction in the budget, especially for the mental health workers. And I was hoping that maybe as part of the spreadsheet or table that you provide at the request of Senator Gansert, that maybe we could see where some of these funds are going to be used in relation to the mental health. If we are going to use some of the federal funds to address the mental health aspect of these COVID pandemic and the virtual schooling, that would satisfy my concern. However, if it's not, I think that that's something that we should be seriously considering. And I don't know if you have any of that information now, or if that's something that you'll have to provide to us later.
Heidi Hartz for the record. As we noted previously, we would need to review each of the subgrants that we have received for the various sources of funding to identify specifically how each school district and the state public charter school will be investing those dollars. But we're happy to work with your staff to ensure that you receive that information.
I would greatly appreciate that. Thank you very much. And thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. Assemblywoman Carlton, Chair Carlton, would you like to go ahead next?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I just want to say that, you know, it's great when we have had programs that have worked. And I want to thank Ms. Benitez Thompson for all of her hard work on this. She started this process years ago. And I remember her coming to my office and convincing me that we really needed to do this. So with social workers in the schools, but I guess one of the questions and one of the overarching questions was, were we going to have enough? Was there going to be access? Were we going to be able to get the social workers to come to the school? Were we going to be able to get the mental health counselors to take the job with the school district? So have we looked at that? Where's the access point? Do we have enough workforce? What are some of the issues with that? Are we having issues getting them to come and work at the schools? Because we realize how important this is.
Christy McGill for the record, Director of the Office of Safe and Respectful Learning. And to answer your first question, we did just get a federal grant to really look at workforce development. So we will be working very closely with our Nevada Higher Education to make sure that we offer plenty of opportunities for our high school youth to go right into the school-based mental health professions. And then also as they get later into their studies and graduate work to having local and paid internships. Research shows that internships result in our students staying in Nevada. And so that was an important piece. Recently, it depends on the community and district about the workforce flow. And so, for example, it is easier, although still, for example, in Clark County, we still are not meeting the ratios of social workers. And in order to meet those national ratios, we would still need to invest in 1,021 social workers. And so this would take UNR and UNLV approximately 1 and 2 years to really work to get that workforce flowing.
And thank you very much, Madam Chair. I think it's always good to look at it from the other side. I have concerns also about defunding it, about some of the cuts that are being proposed. I don't want to use the word defund, I want to use the word cuts. But we also realize there's cuts in a lot of areas in the budget. So we've heard in a lot of other budgets that we have vacant positions because we don't offer a pay scale that is competitive with the rest of the state. And I believe that's one of the components of looking at this to make sure that we can get folks into the school. So thank you very much for the latitude on the question. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Additional questions before we go to the next budget? All right, not seeing any. We'll go to our last budget for the day, budget 2704, and this is the bullying prevention account. So please go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you, Heidi Hartz. For the record, within the bullying prevention budget account, we provide grants that support evidence-based interventions related to anti-bullying, social and emotional well-being, and positive behavior. Decision Unit E275 restores funding for the grant program totaling $45,000 in each year of the biennium. These funds were previously reduced during the 31st special session. In fiscal year 2020, all school districts and charter schools had the opportunity to apply for this competitive grant program, so that they could establish programs that create a school environment that is free of bullying and cyberbullying. They could also use these funds to provide training on policies that had been adopted by their district or charter school to prevent bullying and cyberbullying, or they could use the funds to develop and implement procedures that would allow students and staff the opportunities to discuss bullying and cyberbullying, as well as the policies that had been developed in an effort to prevent either from occurring within a school setting. Decision Unit 915 transfers the Bullying Prevention Grant Program to the state education funding account to be allocated through the pupil-centered funding plan on a per-pupil basis. And with that, we'd be happy to answer questions specific to this budget account.
Thank you very much. I believe Assemblywoman Gorlow, do you have a question on this?
Madam Chair, I have a couple of questions. First, I'm looking at the actual expenditures in fiscal year 2020, and it looks like it was 23,000 plus some change. Could you explain why the full 45,000 was not spent? Or am I missing something?
Madam Chair, we did not hear the entire question.
I'm sorry. I was looking at the actual expenditures for fiscal year 2020 being $23,236, and I was wondering why the full 45,000 wasn't spent, or was that the reduction?
Heidi Hartz, for the record, the amount that was not expended is representative of the general fund reduction that was developed in fiscal year 2020 in order to help the state meet its budgetary shortfall.
Thank you for that clarification. And could you tell me how did the expenditures from the bullying prevention account assist the Office for a Safe and Respectful Learning Environment with its anti-bullying efforts?
Christine McGill, for the record, Office of Safe and Respectful Learning. Thank you for the question. Yes, the in NRS 388 is some very robust training and education requirements that our districts must do in order to reduce bullying. And so these funds allow the districts to look at new and evidence-based curriculums and programs to do just that, to reduce the bullying. It also allows training of staff throughout the schools in order to reduce bullying and to make sure that reporting is quick and that everyone is meeting the bullying laws.
Thank you. And if the transfer of funding is approved, has the department considered whether the bullying prevention account should be eliminated from the Nevada revised statutes?
Heidi Hartz, for the record, it would appear that if there is no funding left in the budget account, that it would be recommended for elimination. With respect to eliminating the account within statute, if the funding is no longer being collected specifically for that purpose, then that would seem to be a reasonable adjustment as well.
Okay, thank you. If I could have one more quick follow-up.
Sure, please.
Thank you. One last question. Do we have any data that's showing reductions in bullying incidents at schools? And if so, where might I find that?
Christine McGill, for the record, Director of the Office of Safe and Respectful Learning. The school districts do report on bullying 2 times a year, and we are, depending on the district, seeing some reduction in bullying. And we can, you can get that off at nevadareport.com, or we can also send that information to your office.
I would appreciate if you could send it to me. Thank you. And one quick, nevadareport.com, or was it Ed?
For the record, Superintendent Ebert, it is nevadareportcard.com.
Thank you. That's all my questions.
Thank you very much. Additional questions from anyone on the committee? Okay, well, not seeing any hands raised. That will conclude our information that we've received today, and we will follow with public comment. Please listen for broadcasting to give instructions, and remember your information is 2 minutes. Please go ahead broadcasting if we have any callers in the queue.
Thank you so much, Chair. We are currently on public comment. If you have recently joined the call and would like to provide public comment, please press *9 now to take your place in the queue. Caller with the last 3 digits, 577. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Good morning, Chris Daly, DALY, Nevada State Education Association, the voice of Nevada educators for over 120 years. We have comments on several of the program budgets presented this morning. Regarding Budget 2699, NSEA is very concerned about the proposed $33 million cut to early literacy supports in the Read by Grade 3 program. A recent presentation from Data Insight Partners to the education committees showed that for the first time ever, Nevada fourth graders are performing at the same level as their national peers, and only 3 states made more progress than Nevada in fourth grade reading achievement over the last decade. This growth was tied to strategic investments made by Nevada through the Read by Grade 3 program, along with investments in Zoom and Victory schools. SB 151 has been heard to reduce the caseloads of licensed educators. NSEA offered an amendment to extend a 5% salary enhancement to school counselors, psychologists, and social workers who have successfully completed a national certification program to develop the highest standards of practice for students. And we would ask for this committee's consideration of this request, especially in light of the increased importance of this work related to the COVID-19 pandemic. Related to Budget 2615, NSEA submitted detailed comments against the transfer of Zoom and Victory funding to the state education funding account. Further, NSEA is concerned about elimination of teacher incentives for continuing teachers in Title I schools, while ongoing and increased funding for new teacher incentives. During the creation of this incentive program in 2017, NSEA argued for the creation of new teacher incentives with parallel retention incentives for veteran teachers to avoid disparities that could disadvantage veteran teachers. With ongoing issues related to teacher retention, especially at Title I schools, we continue this request. Finally, related to budgets 2698 and 2704, NSEA would again caution the legislature, as these program budgets are transferred to the state education funding account, the most important line of accountability between districts and the state is blurred. While requirements may continue in statute, the impetus for districts to deliver on these legislative priorities is watered down. We see this as one of the many unintended consequences of SB 543. I know that my colleague, Alexander Marks, will be making comments regarding Zoom and Victory schools. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next caller.
Thank you, Chair. Caller with the last 3 digits, 486. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin. Caller, we are having difficulty hearing you.
Hello?
Oh, there you go. Thank you.
Okay, I apologize. Alexander Marks, MARKS, with the Nevada State Education Association. NSEA is calling on the legislature to grandfather Zoom and Victory schools, Nevada's model programs of education equity, by not transferring funding for the programs to the new state education funding account. Budget 2615, NDA's School Remediation Trust Fund, proposes transferring funds from Zoom and Victory schools to the state education funding account. Under SB 543, these funds are to be used for student weights taken from Nevada's most impacted schools and spread out across the state, including to schools in higher income areas. While districts will be required to provide from a menu of services related to Zoom and Victory programs, Zoom and Victory schools will receive significantly less money for these services and will not be able to maintain the current level of services for students to continue their success. With reduced funding, the current model will be watered down and compromised. With the shift from a school-based approach to a pupil-centered approach, Zoom and Victory schools lose significant momentum on school climate and culture, jeopardizing the gains made in our most impacted schools. Meanwhile, language in SB 543 limiting the application of student weights to an either-or approach runs counter to educational best practice that recognize that our most impacted students fall into multiple categories of weights and require much greater investment than provided by any single weight in SB 543. This need is greater for students in communities that are beset with serious, intractable social and economic issues. Backers of SB 543 claim the new funding formula was about equity, and if that were true, we wouldn't be already hearing pleas from leaders in Zoom and Victory schools about the impact of budget cuts next school year. Zoom and Victory schools are located in Nevada's poorest communities, serve the highest percentage of at-risk students, and are proven models of education equity. Unfortunately, due to this shift of funds in SB 543, there are also schools facing some of the largest budget cuts. This is inequity, and the legislature should right this wrong by stopping this transfer and grandfathering Nevada's Zoom and Victory schools. Thank you.
Thank you. Next caller.
If you have recently joined the call and would like to provide public comment, please press *9 now to take your place in the queue. Caller with the last 3 digits, 482. Please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Good morning, committee. My name is Gail Tuzzolo, Gail Tuzzollo. Today I am representing Vegas PBS. We would like to thank the committee for the important state funding that has allowed Vegas PBS to continue providing essential services that are a lifeline for vulnerable communities statewide, including a special needs resource library and online educational portal with multimedia resources for educators and students. With prior funding, we have also built upon our data casting and emergency preparedness efforts and funded the production of the 4th and 5th season of Outdoor Nevada, a weekly show dedicated to help boost state tourism, showcasing the people and places that make Nevada unique and fascinating. Vegas PBS has also expanded their efforts in workforce development to address critical needs during the pandemic, and that program continues to grow. We hope with a better economy in the future that we can expand these necessary programs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. The public line is open and working. There are no additional callers at this time.
Okay. Well, I think we have probably allowed sufficient time for all to join as we work through this budget. So with that, I will close our meeting today. Have a nice weekend, and this meeting is adjourned.